Hello again, time then for the press preview. It's the first look at what is on Sunday's front pages. And tonight we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the political editor of the Scottish Sun, Rachel Watson. A very good evening to both of you. We'll chat in a moment. First of all, let's have a look at those front pages for you. We'll start with the Observer, shall we? Focusing on Biden's Warsaw speech and his assertion that the butcher, Putin, cannot be allowed to stay in power. Well, the Telegraph also leads with Biden's speech, echoing the line, "For God's sake, this man can't remain in power." The Express reports on the cost of living crisis with a warning to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister that they risk losing the next election if they fail to deal with it. The Mirror takes a look at William and Kate's stance on the Commonwealth with their statement, "Let the people decide." And the Star also puts the spotlight on the royal family with a story on a naturist cruise celebration of the Queen's Jubilee. And just to remind you, by scanning the QR code you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages as we discuss them. And we are joined tonight by Christina Patterson and Rachel Watson. So lots to talk about. And why don't we start, Rachel, with that speech by President Biden in Warsaw a little earlier. It was a very powerful speech. I mean, the president has come under some criticism over the last few weeks about his handling of this crisis. Front page of the Sunday Telegraph, quoting him, "For God's sake, this man can't remain in power." Talking about Putin, of course. What did you make of it?
Yes, so as you say, this was in some ways a very powerful speech from President Biden. Those words around, "For God's sake, this man can't remain in power," felt like it was a big shift in the stance that the US government has taken in recent weeks and months. Was this, for example, as is suggested in some of the stories, that the US were pivoting and saying that there should be a regime change in Russia, which the White House have come out afterwards, and you can see it in those stories. The line from the White House is that that's not what President Biden was calling for. That's not what he meant when he said it. So it sounded very much like he was calling for a regime change, that Vladimir Putin should not be in charge. But the White House have walked this back slightly. And we can also see that reaction from the Kremlin, where they've hit back again, because we see this war of words, and it's another ramping up of that between NATO allies and Russia again. But despite the speech being powerful, there was a lot of language in there. He referred to Putin as a butcher. There's also been some unhappiness, and I've read some of the reaction from Ukrainian politicians who felt actually there was a lot of words, there was a lot of warm words and harsh language in it, but actually there was very little promise to them. So they want to win this war. They don't just want it to end, they want to win this war. And they felt that there was very little in there. Pledges made by Biden for weapons, for example, and what more the US could do. And I think they'd hoped that this speech at the end of his visit to Poland would really be able to kind of push forward and say what the US were going to do, how the US are going to help Ukraine in this pivotal moment, because it seems like the war is going to stretch out even longer than anybody could have predicted. And they were looking for a little bit more. So I've been reading some of that reaction as well, which isn't really in the papers that I've seen. But I think it's important to reflect back on that.
Yeah, you make a very good point. The front of the Observer also quoting Biden saying, "Butcher Putin cannot be allowed to stay in power." What do you think about that, Christina? I mean, Ukrainians need more than just rhetoric, don't they?
Yes, the Ukrainians do need more than rhetoric, but of course the horrible dilemma that any country faces is Putin's threat of escalation. And that's what the whole of the world is trying to avoid at the moment. And it's agonizing. I think it's agonizing for anybody watching what's happening in Ukraine and seeing the atrocities that are being carried out there on a daily basis, which does look very much like genocide and very, very clearly war crimes. But it remains the case that if the West puts troops into Ukraine or even supplies air cover, then that will be seen as joining the war, and then you are talking World War III. So it is a really agonizing situation, and I can see that Biden is in a very difficult situation. I think part of what we saw in that speech earlier was the kind of passion that he used to show when he talked about apartheid, for example. That campaigning politician, that passion is coming out. And in a sense, maybe it is misplaced, because to be seen to be calling for regime change. I mean, it's in this mad world where anybody sane thinks, of course, Russia needs a different regime. Of course, it needs a different leader, because Putin is leading Russia into disaster. It's leading it into pariah state status. It's leading it into economic nightmares. And it's using its young men, many of them barely children, as cannon fodder. And many, many, many Russian mothers have already, we don't know if it's 10,000 or 15,000, but by the time this thing ends, it will be many, many more. The sacrifices for apparently nothing are absolutely enormous. But to be seen to be calling for regime change, of course, plays into the Kremlin's playbook as well, because that's exactly their point, that the West is anti-Russia, and it feeds into their narratives and their propaganda. So I think one could argue that even though no sane person would think that Putin should stay, one could argue that it is actually a gaffe on Putin's part, on Joe Biden's part, to say this.
Yeah, I mean, it did seem rather strange that it was clearly a scripted speech. He was reading it from auto cue. It had obviously all been approved, and then the White House have to row back slightly on those comments. Let's leave that there and move on to matters back home. Front of the Sunday Express, Rachel, solve the cost of living crisis, or you'll lose the election. The fallout from the mini budget still on many of the front pages.
Yes, so the Sunday Express have got a poll that they've done, and it's found that 63% of people don't think that the Chancellor went far enough with his spring statement mini budget, as you say. Now, there was a lot of criticism of Rishi Sunak after this announcement, and what the government, and when the Chancellor was delivering this announcement, making his speech in the Commons, he had these big pledges, or what he thought were big pledges, pulling the rabbit out of the hat, that would be widely welcomed. So, for instance, the cut to income tax and the raising the threshold for national insurance contributions. These were things that got him a lot of cheers in the Commons. But actually, the whole point of this was that we are going through a cost of living crisis now. There are families who desperately need help now, and neither of these kick in immediately. So the income tax cuts, they won't kick in until 2024. By 2024, the national insurance contribution threshold rise isn't until July. So that's 3 months of the rise in national insurance contributions people will have to pay before it's then offset. So I think there's been a lot of criticism there that he didn't go far enough. There was nothing in there to support people on universal credit either. So there's been this criticism, and I think this poll just really shows how widespread that feeling that the government didn't do enough and aren't doing enough, despite this crisis that is going on with so many families up and down the country impacted by rising costs of energy bills, fuel, what they buy in the shops, prices are going up. And this really just puts that in there. It's also got a figure that 67% of people are struggling with heat and energy costs at the moment. So it shows that this is such a massive issue, and it feels like that the Chancellor took a bit of a wrong turn during the week. He didn't do what was being asked of him.
Yeah, Christina, is it fair? Do you think the British public do put all of this on the Chancellor's shoulders, given that he was dealt a very difficult hand, wasn't he? You know, inflation going up, the pandemic, the energy crisis, the Ukraine war, all issues that weren't of his making.
Well, what was of his making was the statement he made and the measures he's announced, which are absolutely pathetic. I think we saw Rishi Sunak's true colours this week, actually. He managed to present himself during the early stages of the pandemic as Mr. Nice Guy with his furlough measures and so on, and he managed to project himself as a kind of compassionate, nice person. And what we've seen this week is breathtaking cynicism. Cynicism, one might almost say Johnsonian cynicism, because this statement was designed for one group, well, two groups actually, Tory backbenchers and Tory party members, with an eye on his leadership chances. And it was not designed for the public good or for the good of the British people. Let's be clear, this is going to plunge people into poverty. I mean, to call it a cost of living crisis is actually kind of euphemistic. It really, really underplays the scale of the problem. I opened a batch of bills the other day and thought, oh my God, this is a nightmare. You know, I will be okay, but there are many, many people in this country who won't be okay. And it really will be a choice between heating and eating. And that's become a bit of a cliche, but the scale, we've heard reports this week and people with 3 jobs who said they're having to choose between having the heating on and feeding their children. I mean, this is kind of the kind of poverty we haven't seen in this country for a long time. I think when it really hits, people are going to be desperately shocked and upset. And what Rishi Sunak offered this week was absolutely insulting to the British people. Of course he could have done more. He was clinging on to his Thatcherite ideological small state view, and it's just not up to the challenge.
OK, Matt's cartoon in The Telegraph, so good as always, price promise, everything cheaper than it will be very soon, he says to a shopper there. Rachel, just in one sentence, is that fair what Christina has said, that this mini budget wasn't designed for the good of the British people?
I think there's a real feeling that this budget doesn't do what people wanted it to do, and I think there's a lot of frustration out there, and we've seen that. You know, he made the speech and it was going down well, as Christina said, with Tory MPs in the chamber, but as soon as that speech was finished, there was you know, a lot of concern and a lot of frustration from various people that the government need to look at this again and come back with more. OK, all right, we will leave that there. Thank you both very much. Coming up, the Duke of Cambridge's surprising statement on the final day of his Caribbean tour, discussing that in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. Part 2 of the press preview. Christina and Rachel still with us. Rachel, front page of The Observer. International nurses in the UK are forced to pay up if they quit. Explain this to us. So this story is, as you say, about international nurses who have been hired from abroad, and in their contract there is a stipulation that if they leave this job and they want to move to something else or return home, they will have to pay back money that was used in that hiring process. So for things like travel, for example, and other things around their hiring process, they're being asked to pay that back. And there's a figure in there of up to £14,000 that nurses are facing if they leave. And I think I found this story quite shocking, actually, and it's understandable why the comments from President Biden are the splash on the paper. So it's on the front page, which is great. And I found that the detail in this particularly shocking around what, you know, these people have come to the UK to do these jobs, work for NHS trusts. It's not just private companies they're talking here. And they're being given these really quite harsh demands that should they leave within a time frame, they will have to pay this back. And that's an investigation that's been done by The Observer and something they've been looking into. Yeah, and Christina, designed to keep staff on and get back some of the recruitment costs, but, you know, they could end up with huge debt.
I thought it was really shocking. I mean, I think in a way it's bad enough poaching nurses from other countries where they're often needed much more, and often where they've been trained in their own countries and then and are much needed. But we lure them with what are meant to be probably higher wages here, not very high, but probably higher than in their home countries. And then to saddle them with all these extra costs, I think is really shocking. I mean, we mustn't forget that during the pandemic, the strain still continues in many hospitals, and for nurses and doctors, but you know, nurses, the stress of working day in, day out in sort of busy COVID wards was absolutely dreadful. And I've met nurses who've suffered post-traumatic stress disorder from the time they spent during the pandemic. So I think it's a really, really shocking way to treat people who've given all that time and energy and effort in the service of this country. Yeah. Shocking.
I just want to move on very quickly because we're running out of time to the royal story, front page page of the Mirror. Wills let the people decide. It's been quite the tour, this one, hasn't it, Rachel? And his comments today, fascinating, talking about the Commonwealth, and he's sort of accepting that he may well not be head of it one day.
Yeah, and I was just reading some posts on Twitter and some reaction from royal commentators who were saying that this was an unprecedented statement from Prince William. Over the last couple of days, he's made a number of statements or speeches on the tour. And from what I understand, it's been very tightly guarded what he's going to say. It was in the paper that these were last-minute comments. There was changes made to his speech at the last minute. And I think, as you say, he's reflecting on that tour and reflecting with the times, where we are in the times and what people want. He's been listening to people in the Bahamas, in Belize, about what they want from the past, what they want us to look back on and recognise, and those horrors that happened then, but also what they want from their future and whether they want to be part of the Commonwealth. And there did seem to be an acceptance in here from Prince William that, you know, this is not his decision to make. It's not the royal families, it's not the institution, but it's actually the people. And if they decide that they don't want to be part of the Commonwealth, this seems to be fully accepted.
Christina, very quick thought from you on this?
Yeah, I think good for him. I think he's very good at tone, Prince William, and I think he understands that times are changing. I think he's absolutely serious about both about his job and about Black Lives Matter and many of the issues that have come up quite recently, and of course intensely aware of the shameful legacy of slavery, which is always going to be the elephant in the room when you're going on tours like this. So I think he's handled it very well. I think some of the optics have been dreadful. I mean, really kind of colonial pictures, presumably not particularly his fault, but I think he was absolutely right to say this, and good on him. And, you know, this stuff is really outdated, and of course it has to be their choice, and that's just a fact. So it's good that he stated it with grace and dignity.
We must leave it there. Thank you both very much.